My name is Lily Parker, and last Saturday night, my sister Victoria called me a loser in front of 50 people at her engagement party. What she didn't know was that her future father-in-law had been looking for me for 3 months. And when he finally found me standing in that corner, nursing a glass of cheap wine and trying to disappear into the wallpaper, he walked over, extended his hand, and said the 4 words that changed everything. "Thank you, boss." Finally. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my apartment door like a secret someone didn't want to deliver properly. Heavy cardstock, the kind that whispers money when you touch it. Gold foil lettering that caught the light streaming through my kitchen window. Victoria, Parker and Ryan Blackwood request the pleasure of your company at their engagement celebration. Black tie optional, but knowing my sister, it wasn't really optional at all. I held the invitation for a long time, running my thumb over the raised lettering. 3 months. That's how long it had been since Victoria and I had spoken more than surface-level pleasantries. 3 months since the incident at Mom's birthday dinner when she'd made that comment about some people needing to grow up and get real jobs. She'd been looking directly at me when she said it, her eyes sharp with the kind of judgment that cuts deeper because it comes from family. The thing about Victoria is that she's always been the golden child. Not in the obvious way where parents play favorites openly, but in the subtle way where success just seems to follow her around like a well-trained pet. She graduated summa cum laude from Oregon State, landed a marketing position at a prestigious firm right out of college, moved into a sleek apartment in the Pearl District, and somehow managed to make it all look effortless. Meanwhile, I'd dropped out of college during my junior year to pursue freelance web development. A decision that still made our parents exchange those looks across the dinner table. The worst part wasn't even her success. It was how she wore it like armor, using it to deflect any criticism while simultaneously wielding it as a weapon against anyone who didn't measure up to her standards. And lately, I was definitely not measuring up. My freelance business had been struggling. The tech industry in Portland was competitive, and without a degree, I was constantly having to prove myself twice as hard for half the recognition. I'd been living on ramen and optimism for the better part of 6 months, taking whatever projects I could find, including redesigning websites for small businesses that paid in exposure more often than actual money. But I'd built something. 3 years of grinding, learning, failing, and rebuilding had taught me things no classroom ever could. I understood code the way some people understand music, could see problems in digital architecture that others missed, and had developed a reputation among my small client base for solving the unsolvable. It just wasn't the kind of success that looked good on paper or impressed people at family gatherings. The engagement party was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Grand Ballroom at the Pearl Hotel, one of those venues that charges more for appetizers than most people spend on groceries in a week. I'd been to exactly one event there before, a corporate holiday party for one of my clients, and I'd spent the entire evening feeling like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. I almost didn't go. I drafted the polite decline email twice, something about prior commitments and wishing them well. But then I thought about Uncle Ben, my dad's younger brother who always asked about both Victoria and me with equal interest, and how disappointed he'd be if I wasn't there. Uncle Ben was one of the few family members who'd never made me feel like my choices were wrong, just different. So Saturday afternoon found me standing in my bedroom, staring at the contents of my closet like they might spontaneously transform into something appropriate for a black tie optional engagement party. I owned exactly one dress that could be considered formal, a navy blue number I'd bought for job interviews that hung on me like a grocery bag. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone playing dress-up, but it would have to do. The Pearl Hotel sat downtown like a monument to Portland's gentrification, all glass and steel reaching toward the cloudy sky. I walked through the revolving doors at exactly 7:30, fashionably late enough to avoid the initial rush, but early enough to not make an entrance. The lobby buzzed with well-dressed people moving toward the ballroom with the confidence of people who belonged in places like this. I followed the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter down a hallway lined with expensive art until I reached the ballroom entrance. A young woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile checked my name off a list and handed me a table number. Table 12. I'd been to enough weddings to know that table 12 was where they put the people they had to invite, but didn't necessarily want front and center. The ballroom was everything I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables, draped in ivory linens. Centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath reached toward the ceiling like small monuments to good taste. A jazz quartet played softly in one corner while servers in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of champagne and appetizers that probably cost more per bite than my lunch budget for a week. Victoria stood near the entrance in a dress that probably cost more than my rent, greeting guests with the kind of radiant smile that comes naturally to people who've never doubted their place in the world. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and she wore pearls that caught the light every time she turned her head. She looked like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine, which, knowing Victoria, had probably been the goal. Next to her stood Ryan Blackwood, her fiancé, looking comfortable in his tuxedo in the way that suggested he wore formal wear regularly. I'd met him exactly twice, both times at family dinners where he'd been polite but distant, answering questions about his work in finance with the kind of vague responses that suggested either secrecy or boredom. I made my way toward them, rehearsing congratulations in my head, but before I could reach the receiving line, Victoria's eyes found mine across the room. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before reassembling itself into something that looked genuine but felt performed. "Lily!" she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound enthusiastic but couldn't quite manage it. "You made it." The words were right, but the delivery suggested surprise, as if she hadn't really expected me to show up. Which, to be fair, I almost hadn't. I navigated through clusters of guests toward her, catching fragments of conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios and children's private schools. These were Victoria's people now, I realized. Professional, polished, successful in all the ways that mattered to scorecards and social media profiles. "Congratulations," I said when I finally reached her, leaning in for the obligatory hug that felt as awkward as it always did. "The venue is beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, already looking past me toward the next guest in line. "You remember Ryan, of course." Ryan extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuine enough. "Good to see you again, Lily. Thanks for coming." There was something in his expression that made me pause, a flicker of recognition that seemed deeper than our previous brief encounters, but before I could process it, Victoria was already introducing me to the couple behind me, and the moment passed. I found table 12 tucked away near the back corner of the ballroom, close enough to the kitchen that I could hear the clatter of dishes being prepared, but far enough from the action that I felt like I was watching the party through a telescope. My table mates were a mix of Ryan's college friends and distant relatives, pleasant enough people who made polite conversation about the weather and the venue before returning to their own conversations. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, each one more elaborate than the last. Speeches began after the main course, starting with Ryan's father, Marcus Blackwood, who stood at the head table with the kind of confidence that suggested he was comfortable addressing rooms full of people. Marcus was distinguished in the way that comes with age and success, silver-haired and well-tailored, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. When he spoke about his son's happiness and Victoria's wonderful addition to their family, his words carried weight, as if his approval was something worth having. But it was during his speech that I noticed something odd. His eyes kept scanning the room, pausing on faces as if he was looking for someone specific. When his gaze reached my corner table, it lingered for a moment longer than seemed natural, and I had the strange sensation that he was studying me, The speeches continued with Ryan's best man telling embarrassing college stories and Victoria's maid of honor recounting their friendship with the kind of polished anecdotes that sounded rehearsed. Then it was Victoria's turn to speak, and she stood with the grace of someone who'd never met a microphone she couldn't charm. She thanked everyone for coming, talked about finding her perfect match in Ryan, and painted a picture of their future together that sounded like a carefully curated Instagram feed. But then, as she was wrapping up, she made eye contact with me across the room. "I also want to acknowledge my family," she said, her voice taking on a different tone. "My parents, who taught me the value of hard work and perseverance, my various relatives and friends who've supported me through the years, and even my little sister Lily, who's here tonight despite having a very different perspective on success and responsibility." The words hit like ice water. The qualifier was subtle, enough that most people probably didn't catch the insult, but I felt it like a slap. Despite having a very different perspective on success and responsibility. Translation: despite being a disappointment who doesn't understand what real achievement looks like. Heat rose in my cheeks as polite applause rippled through the room. I forced myself to smile and nod, playing the part of the gracious sister, but inside I was reeling. She'd managed to acknowledge me and dismiss me in the same breath, all while maintaining her perfect public image. The rest of the evening blurred together in a haze of forced smiles and small talk. I made appropriate comments about the lovely venue and delicious food while counting the minutes until I could politely escape. The jazz quartet transitioned to dance music, and couples began moving to the center of the ballroom while I retreated further into my corner, nursing a glass of wine that had long since lost its appeal. I was gathering my purse and preparing to slip out quietly when a shadow fell across my table. I looked up to find Marcus Blackwood standing there, his expression serious but not unkind. "Miss Parker?" he said, his voice carrying a slight question mark as if he wanted to confirm my identity. "Yes," I replied, standing automatically out of politeness. "Mr. Blackwood, congratulations on the engagement. You must be very happy." He studied my face for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately? There's something I'd like to discuss." The request was so unexpected that I almost asked him to repeat it. Why would Ryan's father want to speak with me privately? We'd never even been introduced properly. "Of course," I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. He gestured toward a quieter area near the windows that overlooked downtown Portland's lights. As we walked away from the noise of the party, I caught Victoria watching us with a puzzled expression, as if she couldn't understand why her future father-in-law would be interested in talking to her disappointing sister. We stopped near the windows where the sounds of the party became a distant murmur. Marcus turned to face me, and his expression was more serious than the situation seemed to warrant. "Miss Parker," he began, "I have to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive the directness. Do you freelance in web development and digital consulting?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Yes," I said slowly. "I do. How did you... And have you been working under the business name Digital Solutions Northwest?" My heart began to beat faster. Digital Solutions Northwest was the LLC I'd registered for my freelance work, something I'd set up for tax purposes and to sound more professional to potential clients. Very few people knew about it. "Yes," I said again, even more confused. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure I understand why." He held up a hand to stop me, and for the first time since he'd approached my table, he smiled. It transformed his entire face, turning him from intimidating to almost grandfatherly. "Miss Parker," he said, extending his hand toward me. "Thank you, boss. Finally." The words made no sense at first. I stared at his outstretched hand, my brain struggling to process what he'd just said. "Boss?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What could he possibly mean by that? And then, like puzzle pieces falling into place, it hit me. 3 months ago, I'd been hired by a company called Blackwood Industries to solve a critical security vulnerability in their customer database. It had been one of the biggest projects of my career, both in terms of complexity and payment. The project had come through a series of intermediaries and consultants, and I'd never had direct contact with the actual client. The problem had been a nightmare. Their system had been hemorrhaging customer data through a vulnerability that their internal IT team and 2 previous consulting firms had failed to identify. I'd spent 3 weeks diving deep into their architecture, working 18-hour days, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of code until I finally found the issue buried in a legacy system integration that everyone else had overlooked. Fixing it had required rebuilding a significant portion of their security infrastructure, something that should have taken months, but that I'd managed to complete in 6 weeks through a combination of innovative problem-solving and sheer determination. The client had been so relieved and impressed that they'd paid my invoice immediately and included a substantial bonus. But I'd never known the client was Marcus Blackwood. I'd never known that the company I'd saved from a potential data breach catastrophe belonged to the father of my sister's fiancé. "You're kidding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to find you for months," Marcus continued, his hand still extended. "We worked through so many intermediaries that tracking down the actual consultant who solved our problem became nearly impossible. My IT director kept telling me it was someone called Digital Solutions Northwest, but every time we tried to contact you directly, we hit dead ends. I was starting to think you were a ghost." I shook his hand, still reeling from the revelation. I had no idea. The project came through TechBridge Consulting, and they handled all the client communications. TechBridge was one of 3 firms we hired when our internal team couldn't solve the problem, Marcus explained. They subcontracted to you, but they took credit for the solution in all their reports to us. It wasn't until I started digging deeper that I realized the actual work was being done by an individual contractor. The implications began to sink in. TechBridge Consulting had built their reputation on solving impossible problems, but they'd been taking credit for work I'd done. And Marcus Blackwood, one of Portland's most successful tech entrepreneurs, had been trying to find me specifically. "Miss Parker," he continued, "what you did for my company was extraordinary. You solved a problem that was keeping me awake at night, that threatened everything we'd built." When I finally made the connection tonight, when I realized that the brilliant consultant I'd been hunting for months was sitting in the corner at my son's engagement party. He shook his head, as if the coincidence was too much to believe. "I don't understand," I said, though pieces were starting to fall into place. "How did you figure out it was me?" "Your business registration," he said. "It took my team weeks to trace Digital Solutions Northwest back to Lily Parker. And when Ryan mentioned that his fiancé had a sister named Lily who worked in tech, I thought it might be worth checking. But I never imagined." He gestured around the ballroom. "This is not where I expected to finally meet the person who saved my company." The person who saved my company. The words echoed in my head as I thought about Victoria's speech, about being dismissed as someone with a different perspective on success and responsibility. All this time, while my family had been treating my career choice like a phase I'd eventually outgrow, I'd been solving problems that established consultants couldn't handle. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, finding my voice again, "I appreciate you saying that, but I was just doing my job." "No," he said firmly. "What you did went far beyond just doing a job. You saw patterns that others missed, found solutions that others couldn't find, and you did it with an elegance and efficiency that impressed everyone on my team. We've been wanting to offer you a permanent consulting arrangement, maybe even explore bringing you on full-time, but we couldn't find you." A permanent consulting arrangement. Full-time employment with Blackwood Industries, one of the most respected tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of opportunity that could change everything, that could provide the stability and recognition I'd been working toward for years. I glanced back toward the party, where Victoria was holding court near the dance floor, surrounded by admiring friends and family. She caught my eye for a moment, and I could see curiosity in her expression as she watched me talking with Marcus. She had no idea what was happening, no idea that the future father-in-law she was so eager to impress had been searching for months for her loser sister. "I would be very interested in discussing that," I said, turning back to Marcus. "Though, I have to admit, this is not how I imagined this conversation happening." He laughed, a genuine sound that carried over the music. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. Here I was, worried about how to approach this mysterious consultant who'd disappeared into the digital ether, and it turns out you're family. Family. The word hit differently coming from him than it did from Victoria's speech. Marcus Blackwood saw value in what I'd accomplished, recognized the skills I'd spent years developing, appreciated the work I'd done. He didn't see my career as a phase or a disappointment. He saw it as exactly what it was: expertise that had solved a critical problem. "Miss Parker," he said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are you doing on Monday? I'd love to set up a proper meeting, maybe tour our offices, discuss what a formal partnership might look like." Monday. I thought about my calendar, which was embarrassingly empty except for a few small projects that barely covered my rent. The contrast between my reality and this unexpected opportunity was almost overwhelming. "Monday would be perfect," I said. "Excellent. I'll have my assistant send you the details tomorrow." He paused, looking back toward the party where Ryan and Victoria were now dancing, looking every inch the perfect couple. "You know, Ryan's told me quite a bit about Victoria's family, but I don't think he's fully aware of what his future sister-in-law has accomplished." "No," I said quietly. "I don't think anyone is." The truth of that statement settled between us like a shared understanding. For years, I'd been explaining myself to family members who didn't understand what I did or why it mattered. I'd been defending my choices to people who measured success by traditional metrics like degrees and corporate titles. But here was someone who understood exactly what my work meant, who'd experienced firsthand the value of what I could do. "Well," Marcus said with a smile, "I suspect that's about to change." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes. I kept replaying the conversation with Marcus Blackwood, turning his words over in my mind like coins I couldn't believe were real. The person who saved my company. "Thank you, boss." Finally. The phrases echoed through my thoughts as I stared at the ceiling of my small apartment, listening to the rain tap against my windows. By 6 a.m, I'd given up on sleep entirely. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at my kitchen table, watching the gray Portland dawn creep across the sky. My laptop sat open in front of me, the screen displaying my nearly empty email inbox. 3 small website projects, 2 payment reminders, and now an email from Marcus Blackwood's assistant with the subject line, "Monday Meeting, Blackwood Industries." The email was professional but warm, detailing the address of their downtown offices and suggesting a 10 o'clock meeting time. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a line that made my stomach flip. "Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might be interested in discussing our senior consultant opening. Please bring any portfolio materials you feel would be relevant." Senior consultant opening at Blackwood Industries. The kind of position I'd dreamed about but never thought I was qualified for without the right degree, the right connections, the right background. And yet here it was, offered not because of my credentials on paper, but because of what I'd actually accomplished. I spent the morning pulling together a portfolio, gathering screenshots of projects I'd completed, testimonials from small business clients, before and after comparisons of websites I'd rebuilt. It felt strange to see my work laid out like that, to realize how much I'd actually accomplished over the past 3 years. When you're struggling to pay rent, it's easy to focus on what you haven't achieved rather than what you have. Around noon, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Lily," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was fishing for information. "I wanted to thank you for coming last night. It meant a lot to have family there." Family. The same word Marcus had used, but from Victoria. It felt conditional, like a membership that could be revoked at any time. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "It was a beautiful party." "I noticed you talking with Marcus Blackwood for quite a while," she continued, and there it was, the real reason for the call. "He seemed very interested in whatever you two were discussing." I could picture her sitting in her pristine apartment, probably still in her silk pajamas, dying to know what her future father-in-law had found so compelling about her disappointing sister. The sister with the different perspective on success and responsibility. "Just small talk," I said, which was technically true if you considered discovering that your biggest professional triumph had happened without your knowledge to be small. Talk. "Really?" Victoria's voice sharpened with the kind of skepticism she'd perfected over years of not quite believing anything I said. It looked fairly intense from where I was standing. "He was being polite," I replied, "asking about my work, that sort of thing." "Your work," she repeated, and I could practically hear the air quotes. "What exactly did you tell him about your work?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the old assumptions and dismissals. What could I possibly have said about my little freelance projects that would interest a man like Marcus Blackwood? What could someone like me have accomplished that would matter to someone like him? "Nothing exciting," I said, which was perhaps the biggest lie I'd ever told. "Listen, Victoria, I should probably get going. I have some projects to work on today." "Of course you do," she said. But there was something else in her voice now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Well, I'll talk to you. Soon." After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. 3 years of feeling like I had to justify my choices. 3 years of watching Victoria's success overshadow everything I tried to build. 3 years of being treated like the family member who hadn't quite figured out how to be a real adult. And all that time, I'd been solving problems that established consultants couldn't handle. Sunday passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. I pressed my one good blazer, printed copies of my portfolio, and rehearsed answers to questions I imagined Marcus might ask. But underneath the practical preparation was something deeper, a shift in how I was starting to see myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into a professional situation feeling like I had to prove I belonged there. I was walking in as someone who'd already proven what they could do. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Portland weather that matched my nervous energy. I took the Max downtown, watching the city wake up through rain-streaked windows. Business people in expensive coats hurried along sidewalks, disappearing into gleaming office buildings that had always felt like fortresses I couldn't breach. Blackwood Industries occupied 15 floors of a sleek tower in the Pearl District, not far from where Victoria lived. The lobby was all polished concrete and modern art, with a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of marble. I announced myself to the receptionist, a young woman who smiled warmly and directed me to the elevators. Marcus's office was on the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city and mountains beyond. When his assistant led me in, he was standing by those windows, but he turned immediately with a smile. That put me at ease. "Miss Parker," he said, crossing the room to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. I hope you found the building all right." "Please, call me Lily," I said. "And yes, it's beautiful. The view is incredible." "It's one of the perks of being in business for 20 years, he said with a slight smile. "Coffee? Tea? My assistant makes excellent coffee." We settled into comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table, and Marcus opened a folder that I realized contained printouts of my work on their security project. Seeing my code formatted and bound like an official document felt surreal. "I want to start by saying that what you accomplished for us was genuinely remarkable," he began. "Our internal team had been struggling with that vulnerability for months. We'd hired 2 different consulting firms, and both had failed to even identify the source of the problem, let alone solve it." "Sometimes fresh eyes help," I said, though I was beginning to understand that what I'd done was more significant than I'd realized at the time. "It was more than fresh eyes," Marcus replied. "It was innovative thinking. The way you approached the problem, the solution you developed, it showed a level of understanding that frankly impressed everyone on my technical team. And they're not easily impressed." He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a technical report. "After we implemented your fix, we had our security audited by 3 different firms. All of them said it was some of the most elegant code architecture they'd seen. One of them asked if they could hire whoever had written it." The words washed over me like warm water. For 3 years I'd been working in isolation, never quite sure if what I was doing was good enough, if I was developing the right skills, if I was building something meaningful. Client feedback had been positive but limited, usually restricted to comments about meeting deadlines or staying within budget. I'd never received this kind of technical validation. "The truth is," Marcus continued, "we've been looking for someone with exactly your skills for over a year. Someone who can think outside traditional frameworks, who can solve complex problems that our standard approaches can't handle. What you did for us proved that you're exactly the kind of consultant we need." "What would that look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus leaned forward, his expression becoming more animated. "We're launching a new division focused on cybersecurity consulting for mid-sized companies. The market is underserved because most firms either can't afford the big consulting companies or get inadequate service from smaller ones. We want to fill that gap with a team of specialists who can provide enterprise-level security solutions at accessible price points." He pulled out another document, this one with organizational charts and project timelines. "We're looking for someone to head up the technical side of the division. Someone who would work directly with clients to assess their needs, design custom solutions, and lead implementation. It would involve travel, significant client interaction, and the opportunity to build something from the ground up. Head up the technical side, leading implementation, building something from the ground up." These were responsibilities I'd dreamed about but never imagined I'd be offered, especially not at a company like Blackwood Industries. "The position would come with a substantial salary increase over typical freelance income," Marcus continued, "plus equity in the division, comprehensive benefits, and a professional development budget. But more than that, it would give you the platform to do the kind of work you clearly excel at on a much larger scale." "It sounds incredible," I said, and meant it. "But I have to ask, why me? There must be consultants with more traditional backgrounds, people with computer science degrees and corporate experience." Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been hoping I'd ask that question. "Lily, in my experience, the most innovative solutions come from people who haven't been taught that certain things are impossible. You approached our problem without the preconceptions that limited our other consultants. You saw possibilities they couldn't see because you weren't constrained by their assumptions about how things should work." He gestured toward the window, where rain was beginning to streak the glass. "Portland's tech scene is full of brilliant people with impressive credentials. But brilliance without creativity is just sophisticated repetition. What you showed us was creative problem-solving at the highest level. That's not something you can teach in school." The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical details, project timelines, and team structures. Marcus introduced me to several key staff members, including the director of their current IT division and the project manager who would be working closely with the new cybersecurity team. Everyone I met was warm and professional, but more than that, they spoke about the work with genuine enthusiasm. "There's one more thing I want to show you," Marcus said as we prepared to wrap up the meeting. He led me down the hall to a conference room where several people were gathered around a large monitor, displaying complex diagrams and code snippets. "This is our Monday morning technical review," he explained. "The team goes over current projects, identifies challenges, brainstorms solutions. I thought you might be interested in observing." I spent the next 45 minutes listening to discussions that were exactly the kind of collaborative problem-solving I'd been longing for during my years of isolated freelance work. The team was tackling integration challenges, security protocols, and user experience optimization with the kind of deep technical knowledge and creative thinking that made my pulse quicken. When the meeting ended, Marcus walked me back to his office. "So," he said, settling back into his chair, "what are your thoughts, honestly?" I said, "It's everything I've been working toward without quite knowing it. The technical challenges, the collaborative environment, the opportunity to build something meaningful. It feels like the next logical step in my career." "Good," Marcus said, "because I'd like to make you an offer." He outlined the specifics: a starting salary that was more than double what I'd been averaging as a freelancer, equity that would vest over 4 years, comprehensive health and dental coverage, and a professional development budget that would allow me to attend conferences and pursue additional certifications. The position would start in 3 weeks, giving me time to wrap up current projects and transition my existing clients. "I know this is a big decision," Marcus said, "and I don't expect an answer today. Take some time to think it over, discuss it with your family if you'd like, but I hope you'll seriously consider joining our team." As I rode the Max back to my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, "discuss it with your family." The family that had spent Saturday night listening to Victoria described my different perspective on success and responsibility. The family that still saw my career as a phase I'd eventually outgrow. What would they think when they learned that their assessment had been completely wrong? I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood, trying to process what had happened. The Alberta Arts District was quiet on Monday nights, with just a few coffee shops and galleries still open, casting warm light onto rain-slicked sidewalks. This had been my world for 3 years, scraping by in a small apartment, taking whatever projects I could find, building something I believed in despite the constant uncertainty. Now I was being offered the chance to step into a completely different world, one with stability and recognition and the resources to do work that could make a real impact. But more than that, I was being offered validation that what I'd been building all along had value, had merit, had been leading somewhere meaningful. The next morning, I called Marcus and accepted the position. "Excellent," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I'll have HR send over the paperwork today. Welcome to Blackwood Industries, Lily. I think this is going to be the beginning of something very exciting." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen holding my coffee mug and trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 days ago, I'd been the family disappointment sitting at table 12. Now I was going to be heading up a new division at one of Portland's most respected tech companies. I knew I'd have to tell my family eventually, but for now, I wanted to savor this moment. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The different perspective on success and responsibility that Victoria had dismissed so casually had turned out to be exactly what Marcus Blackwood was looking for. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into the transition with an energy I hadn't felt in months. I finished up my remaining freelance projects, officially closed Digital Solutions Northwest, and began the process of onboarding at Blackwood Industries. The HR department was efficient and welcoming, walking me through benefit selections and introducing me to colleagues who would be working on the new cybersecurity division. The work was everything Marcus had promised and more. My first major project involved developing a security assessment protocol for a chain of medical clinics, the kind of complex, multi-layered challenge that required both technical expertise and creative problem-solving. For the first time in my career, I had access to resources, support staff, and collaboration that allowed me to focus entirely on the work itself, rather than worrying about invoicing and client management. But perhaps the most satisfying part was the respect I encountered at every level of the organization. My ideas were taken seriously, my input was valued, and my expertise was recognized without qualification or condescension. After years of having to prove myself with every new client, of constantly justifying my unconventional background, I was working with people who judged me entirely on the quality of my work. It was during my second week at Blackwood Industries that Victoria called again. "Lily," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of confusion, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being nosy." "What's up?" I replied, though I had a feeling I knew where this was going. Ryan mentioned that his father has been talking about bringing someone new into the company, some cybersecurity consultant he's been trying to track down for months. Apparently, this person solved some major problem that other firms couldn't handle, and Marcus has been singing their praises to anyone who'll listen. "That's nice," I said neutrally. "The thing is," Victoria continued, "he keeps mentioning this consultant's innovative approach and creative problem-solving, and it reminded me of things Marcus said about your conversation at the engagement party. You didn't happen to mention anything about cybersecurity work when you talked to him, did you?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Victoria was putting pieces together, trying to reconcile her image of me with the possibility that I might be the consultant Marcus had been praising so highly. "We talked about a lot of things," I said, which was true if incomplete. "Lily." Victoria's voice took on the sharp edge it always carried when she suspected I wasn't being entirely forthcoming. "What exactly do you do for work? I mean, specifically, what kind of projects do you work on?" For 3 years, whenever family members asked about my work, I'd given vague answers about website development and small business consulting. It was easier than trying to explain complex technical projects to people who didn't understand technology and weren't particularly interested in learning. But now, with a signed offer letter from Blackwood Industries sitting on my desk, I felt a shift in how I wanted to answer that question. "I work in cybersecurity," I said simply. "I help companies identify and fix vulnerabilities in their digital infrastructure." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Cybersecurity," Victoria repeated finally, her voice flat with disbelief. "You work in cybersecurity?" "Yes." "And you've been doing this for how long?" "About 3 years." Another long pause. "Lily, are you telling me that you're the consultant Marcus has been trying to find? The one who solved their security problem?" "Yes," I said, and the word felt like opening a door I'd kept locked for too long. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The conversation that followed was unlike any Victoria and I had ever had. For the first time in our adult lives, she was asking me questions about my work with genuine curiosity, rather than polite dismissal. She wanted to know about the technical challenges I'd solved, the clients I'd worked with, the projects I'd completed. And for the first time, I answered her questions fully, without downplaying my accomplishments or apologizing for my unconventional path. "Jesus, Lily," she said finally, "why didn't you ever tell us any of this? Why did you let us think you were just scraping by with small projects? Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject," I replied. "Because whenever I mentioned a project I was proud of, someone made a comment about when I was going to get a real job. Because it was easier to let you underestimate me than to keep defending something you clearly didn't value." The truth of those words settled between us like sediment in still water. For years, I'd protected myself from my family's judgment by simply not sharing the parts of my life they couldn't appreciate. It had been a defensive strategy that worked, but it had also created a version of myself that bore little resemblance. to who I actually was. I'm starting a new position next week, I continued. Senior cybersecurity consultant at Blackwood Industries. I'll be heading up their new consulting division. Victoria was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. Lily, I owe you an apology. A big one. I've been wrong about a lot of things. Victoria's apology should have felt like vindication, but instead it left me hollow. 3 years of being dismissed, 3 years of watching her roll, her eyes whenever I mentioned my work, 3 years of family dinners where my career was treated like an embarrassing hobby I'd eventually abandon. And now, because Marcus Blackwood had validated what I'd been trying to tell them all along, suddenly she was sorry. I appreciate that, I said, my voice careful and measured. But Victoria, this isn't new information. I've been doing this work for years. The only thing that's changed is that someone you respect finally noticed. That's not fair, she replied, though her protest lacked conviction. We didn't know how successful you were being. You never really explained what you were working on. I tried, I said, and the frustration I'd been bottling up for years finally began to spill out. Remember Dad's birthday dinner last year when I mentioned landing that big security contract? You literally said, "That's nice, Lily," and then immediately started talking about your promotion. Remember Christmas when I tried to explain the encryption project I was working on? Mom cut me off to ask when I was going to consider graduate school. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of accumulated dismissals and missed opportunities for understanding. I could picture Victoria, in her pristine apartment, probably pacing across her hardwood floors the way she did when she was uncomfortable. You're right, she said finally. We didn't listen. I didn't listen. I had this idea in my head about what success looked like, and anything that didn't fit that mold just didn't register as important. The admission hung in the air between us, but it didn't erase the years of feeling invisible in my own family. It didn't undo the damage of being treated like the sibling who hadn't quite figured out how to be a real adult. And it certainly didn't erase Saturday night's speech about my different perspective on success and responsibility. Victoria, I said, I need you to understand something. I didn't keep my accomplishments secret to punish anyone or to create some dramatic reveal. I kept them private because it was exhausting to constantly justify my choices to people who had already decided they weren't valid. But if you'd known what? If you'd known that my work was impressive, enough to catch Marcus Blackwood's attention, then you would have taken it seriously? That's exactly the problem. My work was always worth taking seriously, regardless of whether someone with the right credentials validated it. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Victoria promising to call again soon, and me agreeing while knowing that something fundamental had shifted between us. Her apology felt less like genuine remorse and more like recalibration, an adjustment of her perception based on new information rather than a recognition that her old assumptions had been wrong. I threw myself into my new role at Blackwood Industries with an intensity that surprised even me. The cybersecurity division was launching with 3 major clients, and I found myself working 12-hour days designing security protocols, conducting vulnerability assessments, and building the infrastructure for what Marcus envisioned as a game-changing approach to mid-market cybersecurity. The work was challenging in the best possible way. Instead of working alone in my apartment, I was part of a team of specialists who brought different expertise to complex problems. Sarah Chen, our project manager, had a gift for translating technical requirements into clear timelines and deliverables. David Kumar, our senior analyst, could spot potential vulnerabilities in system architectures with an almost supernatural intuition. And Tom Rodriguez, our client relations specialist, had the rare ability to explain complex security concepts to non-technical executives without condescending or oversimplifying. Working with this team felt like finally speaking my native language. After years of struggling to communicate in translation, we could dive deep into technical discussions without anyone feeling lost or excluded. We could debate implementation strategies with the kind of passionate focus that comes from genuine expertise. And most importantly, we shared a common understanding of what we were trying to accomplish and why it mattered. My first major presentation was to the board of a regional healthcare network that had experienced a series of minor security breaches. Their IT director was a nervous man in his 50s who kept emphasizing how important it was that any solution be foolproof and future-ready. Their CEO was a sharp woman who asked pointed questions about costs, timelines, and measurable outcomes. I'd spent weeks preparing for this presentation, not just developing the technical solution, but thinking carefully about how to communicate its value to people who didn't live and breathe cybersecurity. When the day arrived, I found myself standing in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, my laptop connected to a large monitor displaying the security architecture I'd designed specifically for their needs. "The challenge you're facing," I began, "isn't just about preventing future breaches. It's about building a security framework that can evolve with your organization as it grows and as threats become more sophisticated." I walked them through the assessment I'd conducted, highlighting vulnerabilities I'd identified in their current system and explaining how each element of my proposed solution addressed specific risks. But more than that, I helped them understand how cybersecurity could become a competitive advantage rather than just a necessary expense. When your patients trust you with their medical information, they're making a fundamental assumption about your ability to protect that data, I explained. A robust security framework doesn't just prevent breaches. It enables you to expand services, integrate new technologies, and build partnerships with confidence. The questions came fast and detailed. How would the implementation affect their TGI? Current workflow? What training would their staff need? How would they measure the effectiveness of the new protocols? I answered each one with specificity and confidence, drawing on research I'd conducted and similar projects I'd completed. When the presentation ended, the CEO shook my hand with a firmness that suggested approval. "Miss Parker," she said, "this is exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need. When can you start?" Walking out of that building, contract signed and implementation timeline agreed upon, I felt a professional satisfaction I'd never experienced as a freelancer. It wasn't just about landing a big client or earning a substantial fee. It was about being recognized as an expert, about having my recommendations accepted and valued, about being trusted with work that would make a real difference. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from my colleagues. Over lunch after the successful presentation, Sarah raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Lily," she said, "for making the rest of us look good by association." "That presentation was masterful," David added. "The way you connected their business objectives to technical requirements, it was like watching someone speak two languages simultaneously." Tom nodded enthusiastically. "I've seen a lot of consultants pitch security solutions, and most of them either get too technical and lose the business people, or they oversimplify and insult the technical people. You found exactly the right balance." These weren't empty compliments or professional courtesy. These were colleagues who understood the work intimately, who had seen enough presentations to recognize when something was done exceptionally well. Their approval meant more to me than any family praise ever had, because it was based on competence rather than obligation. As October turned into November, word began to spread through Portland's tech community about Blackwood Industries' new cybersecurity division. We were featured in a Portland Business Journal article about innovative security startups. Marcus was invited to speak at a cybersecurity conference in Seattle, and he asked me to co-present on our approach to mid-market solutions. It was during this period of professional momentum that I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. "Lily, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. "Your father and I were wondering if you might like to join us for dinner this weekend. Victoria mentioned that you've started a new position, and we'd love to hear about it." The invitation felt loaded with subtext. My parents had never shown particular interest in my work before, and the timing suggested that Victoria had filled them in on recent developments. I found myself wondering what version of the story they'd heard, and how much of my success they were prepared to acknowledge. "Sure," I said. "That would be nice." "Wonderful. Saturday at 6? And Lily, feel free to bring anyone you'd like, if you're seeing someone or if you have colleagues you'd like us to meet." The suggestion that I might have colleagues worth introducing to the family was so foreign that it took me a moment to process it. For years, family dinners had been exercises in deflection, where I minimized my work to avoid uncomfortable questions or dismissive comments. Now my mother was actively inviting professional discussion. Saturday evening found me standing on the front porch of my parents' house in the West Side Hills, holding a bottle of wine and trying to prepare myself for what was likely to be a very different kind of family dinner. The house looked the same. As always, a carefully maintained colonial with manicured landscaping and window boxes that changed seasonally. But something about my own perspective had shifted enough that it felt like returning to a place I'd once lived rather than coming home. My mother answered the door wearing the kind of elegant, casual outfit she favored for family gatherings, and her smile seemed genuinely warm rather than performatively polite. "Lily, you look wonderful," she said, embracing me with more enthusiasm than usual. Come in. Your father's in the kitchen pretending to help with dinner." The house smelled like my childhood, a combination of my mother's signature candles and whatever elaborate meal she'd spent the day preparing. Family dinner at the Parker house was always a production, with multiple courses and carefully selected wines and conversation topics planned in advance, like a dinner party for people who happened to be related. My father emerged from the kitchen, wearing an apron that read "World's Greatest Dad," and carrying a wooden spoon like a conductor's baton. He'd been wearing that apron for at least 15 years, and it had become something of a family joke. But tonight, his smile seemed less forced than usual. "There's our cybersecurity expert," he said, and the phrase sounded strange in his voice, like a language he was still learning to speak. "Your mother's been bragging about you to everyone at the country club." "Dad?" I said, accepting his hug. "You don't have to make a big deal about it." "Are you kidding? My daughter's working with Marcus Blackwood. Do you know how many people know that name? He's practically a legend in Portland business circles." The emphasis on Marcus's name, rather than my accomplishments, stung more than I'd expected. Even now, my father's pride seemed to be based more on association with someone important than recognition of what I'd actually achieved. But I pushed down the familiar disappointment and focused on the fact that this dinner represented progress, even if it wasn't perfect progress. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later with Ryan in tow, and I watched my parents' faces light up in the way they always did when their golden child entered a room. But tonight there was something different in Victoria's expression when she looked at me, a cautious respect that hadn't been there before. "Lily," she said, "you remember Ryan, of course." Ryan stepped forward with a smile that seemed more genuine than our previous interactions had warranted. "Good to see you again, Lily. I've been hearing a lot about your work lately. My father can't stop talking about the new cybersecurity division." "It's been an exciting few weeks," I replied, wondering how much Victoria had told him about our recent conversations. "Actually," Ryan continued, "I was hoping to pick your brain about something. My company's been having some network security issues, and our IT consultant keeps giving us answers that don't really make sense. Would you mind if I ran the situation by you?" The request caught me off guard. Ryan worked in finance, and his company was exactly the kind of mid-sized firm that Blackwood Industries was designed to serve. But more than that, he was asking, for my professional opinion with the kind of deference people usually reserved for established experts. Of course, I said. I'd be happy to take a look. Over dinner, my parents asked detailed questions about my work, and for the first time in my adult life, they seemed genuinely interested in the answers. My mother wanted to know about the clients I was working with and the problems I was solving. My father asked about the business model and growth projections for the new division. Victoria listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for her own career updates. But it was Ryan who asked the most insightful questions. He wanted to understand how cybersecurity had evolved over the past few years, what trends I was seeing in the industry, what advice I'd give to companies trying to balance security with operational efficiency. His questions revealed a sophistication about business technology that I hadn't expected, and our conversation quickly became the kind of detailed professional discussion I usually only had with colleagues. The thing most people don't understand about cybersecurity, I found myself explaining, is that it's not just about preventing bad things from happening. It's about enabling good things to happen safely. When you have robust security protocols, you can take advantage of new technologies, explore innovative partnerships, expand into new markets. Security becomes a platform for growth rather than a constraint on it. That's exactly what my father keeps saying, Ryan replied. He says bringing you onto the team has changed how the whole company thinks about technology infrastructure. The words settled into the room like a benediction. Here was confirmation, from someone with no obligation to flatter me, that my work was making a real impact. That Marcus Blackwood, a man I'd come to respect enormously, was crediting me with changing how his company approached fundamental business challenges. After dinner, while my parents cleaned up in the kitchen and Victoria made coffee, Ryan and I continued our conversation on the back deck. The November air was crisp, but not cold, and the lights of downtown Portland twinkled in the distance like earthbound stars. I have to tell you something, Ryan said, leaning against the railing. Victoria's been beating herself up pretty badly about how she treated your career. She keeps talking about things she said at family dinners, comments she made about your work. She doesn't need to beat herself up, I replied, though I appreciated knowing that my sister was genuinely reflecting on her behavior. We all make assumptions about things we don't understand. Maybe, Ryan said, but some assumptions hurt more than others. And when someone you love has been trying to share something important with you, and you keep dismissing it. He shook his head. That's harder to brush off. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria joining us on the deck, carrying 3 mugs of coffee and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. What are you two talking about out here? She asked, settling into one of the deck chairs. Ryan was telling me about some security issues at his company, I said, which was true if incomplete. Actually, Ryan said, I was telling Lily how proud you are of her work, and how sorry you are about not taking it seriously before. Victoria looked down at her coffee mug, and for a moment she looked younger, less polished, more like the sister I'd grown up with before success and expectations had built walls between us. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other day, she said quietly. About all the times I changed the subject when you tried to talk about your projects. About all the times I made comments about you needing a real job. She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright with what might have been tears. Lily, I was so focused on protecting my own image of success that I couldn't see yours. I was so invested in being the daughter who did everything right that I needed you to be the daughter who hadn't quite figured it out yet. The admission hung in the air between us, honest and painful, and more vulnerable than Victoria had ever been with me. I could see Ryan watching her with the kind of gentle attention that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd discussed this topic. I don't need you to feel guilty, I said, and I meant it. But I do need you to understand that my choices were never about rejecting your version of success. They were about building something that felt authentic to me. I know that now, Victoria replied, and I'm not just sorry about not listening. I'm sorry about not being the kind of sister who made you feel like you could share the things you were proud of." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering years of misunderstood interactions and missed opportunities for connection. It wasn't a magical reconciliation that erased all the hurt, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, I felt like Victoria was seeing me as I actually was, rather than as her projection of who I should be. When I finally drove home, to my apartment that night, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The evening had gone better than I'd dared to hope, but it had also highlighted how much time we'd lost to misunderstanding and judgment. I was building the career I'd always wanted, earning the respect I'd always craved, but the validation had come at the cost of years of feeling isolated from my own family. My phone buzzed with a text message as I was getting ready for bed. It was from Victoria. "Thank you for being patient with us. I'm proud of you, and I should have said that a long time ago." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Thank you for saying it now." But even as I typed the words, I found myself thinking about Marcus Blackwood's reaction when he'd finally found me at the engagement party. "Thank you, boss. Finally." The gratitude in his voice had been for work I'd already completed, recognition I'd already earned. He hadn't needed to adjust his perception based on new information. He'd simply been looking for someone whose abilities he already respected. That was the kind of recognition I'd been seeking all along. Not the conditional approval that came after external validation, but the authentic appreciation that came from people who understood the value of what I was building. And as I settled into sleep that night, I realized that I'd finally found both the work and the recognition I'd been working toward for so long. The following Monday brought news that would test everything I'd learned about standing up for myself and demanding the respect I'd earned. Marcus called me into his office first thing in the morning, but instead of his usual warm smile, his expression was serious, almost grim. "Lily," he said, "we need to talk about something, and I'm not sure you're going to like what I have to tell you." My stomach dropped as I settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk. His tone carried the weight of bad news, and after weeks of professional triumph, I wasn't prepared for whatever setback was coming. The morning light streaming through his office windows seemed harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows across his face. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what looked like a legal document. "I received a call Friday afternoon from TechBridge Consulting. They're claiming that the security solution you developed for us was created using proprietary methodologies they developed, and they're threatening legal action." The words hit me like cold water. TechBridge Consulting was the firm that had subcontracted the original project to me, the one that had taken credit for my work in their reports to Blackwood Industries. Now they were claiming ownership of the solution I'd developed independently. "That's ridiculous," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Everything I created was original work. I never had access to any TechBridge methodologies or proprietary systems. They hired me as an independent contractor to solve a problem they couldn't handle." "I believe you," Marcus said quickly. "But they're claiming that the approach you used incorporates elements of their intellectual property, and they want compensation for what they're calling unauthorized use of their trade secrets." I felt a familiar surge of the anxiety that had plagued my freelance years, the constant worry that success would somehow be taken away, that I'd be revealed as inadequate or fraudulent. But this time, underneath the anxiety, was something new. Anger. Clean, focused anger at the injustice of having my work challenged by people who had failed to solve the problem themselves. "Do you have documentation of your development process?" Marcus asked. "Anything that shows how you arrived at the solution independently?" "Everything," I said. "I keep detailed logs of my work, version histories of all code development, research notes, communication records. I can prove every step of the process." Marcus's expression relaxed slightly. "Good. That's exactly what our legal team is going to need. But Lily, I want you to understand something. This kind of challenge is unfortunately common in our industry. Established firms sometimes feel threatened by independent consultants who can solve problems they can't, and they use intellectual property claims as a way to maintain their market position. So, what happens now? I asked. Now we fight back, Marcus said with a firmness that surprised me. We're not going to let TechBridge intimidate us or undermine the work you've done. Our legal team is already preparing a response, and we're going to make it very clear that we stand behind our consultants and won't tolerate frivolous challenges to legitimate work. The next few hours passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers, document gathering, and detailed explanations of my development process. Blackwood Industries' legal team was thorough and professional, but I could see the concern in their eyes as they reviewed TechBridge's claims. Intellectual property disputes in the tech industry could be expensive and time-consuming, even when the claims were baseless. By afternoon, word had spread through the office that our newest team member was facing a legal challenge. The response from my colleagues was immediate and unanimous support. Sarah Chen stopped by my desk to offer help with documentation. David Kumar volunteered to review my code and provide expert testimony about its originality. Tom Rodriguez offered to reach out to industry contacts who might have dealt with similar challenges from TechBridge. This is exactly the kind of bullying that gives consulting firms a bad name, Sarah said, her voice tight with indignation. They can't solve a problem, so they try to claim ownership of someone else's solution. It's disgusting. But it was Marcus's response that meant the most to me. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the office after a day of legal preparation, he knocked on my cubicle wall. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. We walked to his office, where he closed the door and gestured for me to sit. The late afternoon light painted everything in warm gold, but his expression was serious. "Lily," he said, "I want you to know that this challenge from TechBridge doesn't change anything about how we see your work or your value to this company. If anything, it reinforces our belief that we made the right decision in hiring you." You, I said, though the words felt inadequate for the relief I was feeling. "More than that," Marcus continued, "I want you to know that we're going to use this as an opportunity to make a statement about how we support our team members. TechBridge has apparently been using these kinds of intimidation tactics for years, claiming credit for work done by independent contractors, and then threatening legal action when those contractors try to build on their own innovations." He pulled out a draft press release from his desk. "We're going public with this. We're going to explain exactly what happened, how your original work saved our company, and how we're responding to attempts to undermine independent innovation. This isn't just about defending you. It's about defending the principle that good work should be recognized and protected." Reading the press release, I felt a surge of emotion that caught me off guard. Here was a company, a respected leader in the industry, willing to put their reputation on the line to defend my work and my integrity. It was the kind of support I'd never imagined receiving, the kind of validation that went far beyond professional courtesy. "Marcus," I said, "you don't have to do this. A public fight with TechBridge could create complications for Blackwood Industries. You don't need that kind of controversy." "Yes, we do," he replied firmly, "because if we don't stand up to this kind of behavior, it's going to keep happening. Independent consultants like you are the future of our industry, and established firms that can't compete on merit shouldn't be allowed to use legal intimidation to maintain their market position." The press release went out the next morning, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from other independent consultants who had faced similar challenges from TechBridge. Industry publications picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between innovative independent work and corporate bullying. But the most significant call came from an unexpected source, a journalist from TechCrunch who had been investigating TechBridge's business practices for months. "Miss Parker," she said, I've been working on a story about intellectual property abuse in the consulting industry, and your case is exactly the kind of example I've been looking for. Would you be willing to speak with me about your experience? The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon, giving me time to prepare with Blackwood Industries' communications team. I'd never spoken to the press before, and the prospect of having my story published in a major tech publication was both thrilling and terrifying. The key, explained Jennifer Walsh, Blackwood's head of communications, is to focus on the facts and let your work speak for itself. Don't get defensive or emotional. Just explain what you did, how you did it, and why TechBridge's claims are baseless. The interview took place in a conference room at Blackwood Industries, with the journalist joining by video call. She was younger than I'd expected, probably close to my age, with sharp eyes and the kind of rapid-fire questioning style that suggested extensive preparation. "Let's start with the technical details," she said. "Can you walk me through the security, vulnerability you identified, and how your solution differed from previous approaches?" For the next hour, I explained the problem I'd been hired to solve, the research I'd conducted, the innovative approach I'd developed, and the results I'd achieved. The journalist asked detailed follow-up questions, clearly understanding the technical aspects well enough to probe for specifics. "Now," she said, "let's talk about TechBridge's claims. They're saying that your solution incorporates their proprietary methodologies. How do you respond to that?" "With documentation," I replied. "I keep detailed records of every step of my development process. I can show exactly how I arrived at each element of the solution, what research informed my decisions, and how my approach differed from standard industry practices. Nothing I developed came from TechBridge methodologies because I never had access to their proprietary systems." Have you seen this pattern before? Established firms claiming ownership of independent contractor work? Not personally, but since this story broke, I've heard from dozens of other consultants who've faced similar challenges. It seems to be a common tactic for firms that can't compete on technical merit. The interview concluded with questions about my background, my transition from freelance work to joining Blackwood Industries, and my thoughts on the future of independent consulting in the tech industry. Throughout the conversation, I found myself speaking with a confidence I'd never felt in professional settings before. This wasn't just about defending my work. It was about advocating for an approach to innovation that valued creativity and problem-solving over credentials and institutional power. The article published 3 days later under the headline, "The Independent Consultant Fighting Corporate IP Bullying." It featured my story prominently, but placed it in the context of a broader investigation into TechBridge's business practices. The journalist had uncovered similar cases going back several years, creating a pattern of behavior that looked increasingly predatory. The response was immediate and substantial. Within hours of publication, TechBridge announced they were withdrawing their legal claims against me and Blackwood Industries. By the end of the week, 2 other major consulting firms had announced new policies to better protect independent contractors from intellectual property disputes. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Marcus during our weekly team meeting the following Monday. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge what Lily accomplished this week," he said, addressing the entire cybersecurity division. "Not just in defending her work, but in standing up for principles that matter to all of us. Independent innovation, creative problem-solving, and the courage to fight back against institutional bullying." He turned to me with a smile. "Lily, when I first hired you, I knew you were technically brilliant. What I didn't fully appreciate was your strength of character. This week, you've shown our entire industry what it looks like to defend your work with integrity and professionalism." The applause from my colleagues felt different from any professional recognition I'd received before. It wasn't just about technical competence or project completion. It was about standing up for something important, about using my platform to defend principles that mattered beyond just my individual success. After the meeting, Sarah Chen approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Lily," she said, I need to tell you something. When Marcus first hired you, some of us were skeptical. Not about your technical skills, but about whether someone without traditional corporate experience could handle the kind of challenges we face in this division. My heart sank slightly, though I tried not to let it show on my face. But watching how you handled this situation, Sarah continued, the way you documented your work, the way you stood up to TechBridge, the way you turned a legal challenge into an opportunity to advocate for the industry, that's the kind of leadership we need. Thank you, I said, though I wasn't sure where she was going with this. I'm saying this because Marcus asked me to sound you out about something. The division is growing faster than we anticipated, and we're going to need someone to head up client relations and business development. Someone who can represent our values to potential clients, who can articulate our approach to the market, who can be the public face of what we're building here. The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I was still processing. Head of client relations and business development. A leadership role that would put me at the center of the division's growth strategy. That would make me responsible for shaping how we presented ourselves to the industry. It would mean more travel, Sarah continued, more public speaking, more responsibility for the business side of what we do. But it would also mean a significant salary increase, equity in the division's success, and the opportunity to shape how cybersecurity consulting evolves in the Pacific Northwest. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, I'd been sitting at table 12 at Victoria's engagement party, feeling like a ghost at my own family's celebration. I'd been struggling to pay rent, taking whatever projects I could find, building something I believed in despite constant uncertainty about whether it would ever lead anywhere meaningful. Now I was being offered the chance to lead business development for a division that was already being recognized as innovative and influential. I was being asked to be the public face of an approach to consulting that valued creativity and problem-solving over credentials and institutional power. Sarah, I said, I'm interested, very interested, but I need to ask you something honestly. Are you offering me this role because you think I'm the best person for it, or because the publicity from the TechBridge situation makes me a valuable spokesperson? She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd been hoping I'd ask that question. Both, she said. The publicity doesn't hurt, but Marcus and I have been watching how you work with clients, how you communicate complex technical concepts, how you build relationships based on competence and trust. You have a gift for making people feel confident about cybersecurity decisions, and that's exactly what this role requires. Plus, she added with a grin, you've proven that you can handle pressure and controversy with grace. In business development, that's not optional. It's essential. That evening, I called my parents to share the news about both the TechBridge resolution and the new opportunity. My mother answered on the second ring, and I could hear the pride in her voice as I explained what had happened. Lily, she said, your father and I have been following the story online. We're so proud of how you handled everything. You stood up for yourself and for other people in your industry. That takes real courage. Thanks, Mom. It means a lot to hear you say that. And this new role they're offering you, it sounds like exactly the kind of opportunity you've been working toward. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both my parents asking detailed questions about my work, my plans, and my thoughts about the future. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like they were genuinely interested in my career rather than politely tolerating it. When Victoria called later that evening, her first words were, "Holy shit, Lily! I just read the TechCrunch article." "Language," I said automatically, then laughed at my own response. "I'm serious," she continued. "I had no idea you were dealing with something like this. And the way you handled it, the way you turned it into a statement about the industry, that's incredible." "Thank you," I said, though I was still processing the strangeness of receiving career advice and professional admiration from my sister. "Ryan's been sharing the article with everyone at his company," Victoria continued. "He keeps saying that his future sister-in-law is going to be famous in the tech world." future sister-in-law. The phrase carried implications about family, about belonging, about being seen as someone worth claiming rather than someone to be managed or minimized. After years of feeling like the family member who didn't quite fit, it was a shift I hadn't expected, but found myself deeply appreciating. "Victoria," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you made that speech at your engagement party about my different perspective on success and responsibility, did you really believe that? Or were you just trying to manage the situation?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Both," she said finally. "I did think your approach was different, and I was worried about how it reflected on the family. But Lily, I was wrong about what different meant. I thought it meant less successful, less serious, less valuable. I didn't understand that it might mean more innovative, more authentic, more impactful." "I needed to hear that," I said. "Not because I needed your approval, but because I needed to know that you could see the difference." "I can see it now," Victoria replied. "And I'm sorry it took so long." The next morning, I walked into Marcus's office and accepted the business development position. As I shook his hand, I thought about that moment at the engagement party when he'd approached my table with a serious expression and asked to speak with me privately. At the time, I'd had no idea what he wanted or why he was interested in talking to me. Now I understood that he'd been looking for someone who could solve problems others couldn't solve, who could think creatively under pressure, who could represent innovative approaches to established industry challenges. He'd been looking for someone exactly like me, and the only surprise was that it had taken him months to find me. "Welcome to the leadership team, Lily," Marcus said. "I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something extraordinary." 6 months into my new role as head of client relations and business development, I found myself standing in the lobby of the Grand Ballroom at the Pearl Hotel, the same venue where Victoria's engagement party had taken place. But this time, I wasn't clutching a cheap glass of wine and hiding in the corner. I was here as the keynote speaker for the Pacific Northwest Cybersecurity Summit, addressing an audience of 300 industry professionals about the future of independent consulting. The transformation felt surreal. The same space that had witnessed my sister dismissing my different perspective on success was now hosting my presentation on innovation in cybersecurity. The same ballroom where Marcus Blackwood had first approached me with gratitude and recognition was where I would be sharing the stage with some of the most respected names in the industry. As I adjusted my wireless microphone and reviewed my presentation notes one final time, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished marble walls. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the person who had attended that engagement party. She stood with confidence, wore her expertise comfortably, and carried herself like someone who belonged exactly where she was. The audience was already seated when I walked onto the stage, a sea of faces representing consulting firms, corporate IT departments, startup founders, and independent contractors from across the region. I spotted Marcus in the third row, beaming with the kind of pride that comes from watching someone you believed in exceed even your highest expectations. Sarah Chen sat beside him, holding her phone up to record my presentation for the team members who couldn't attend. But it was the sight of my family in the front row that caught me completely off guard. Victoria and Ryan sat together, both dressed professionally and looking genuinely eager to hear what I had to say. Next to them were my parents, wearing the kind of formal attire usually reserved for important occasions, their faces bright with anticipation. Even Uncle Ben had made the trip from Eugene, giving me a subtle thumbs up when our eyes met. The gate moderator introduced me with a biography that still sounded foreign to my ears. Lily Parker, head of business development for Blackwood Industries' cybersecurity division, recognized industry advocate for independent consulting practices, and the consultant whose innovative security solutions have been adopted by over 50 companies across the Pacific Northwest. As I stepped up to the podium, the applause was warm and sustained. I looked out at the audience, many of whom I now knew personally through conferences, client meetings, and industry events, and felt a calm confidence settle over me. 8 months ago, I began. I was working alone in a small apartment, taking whatever cybersecurity projects I could find, building something I believed in despite having no idea where it was leading. I thought success meant landing enough contracts to pay my rent. I thought recognition meant having clients refer me to their colleagues. I thought belonging meant finding people who understood what I was trying to accomplish. The room was quiet, attentive, and I could see people leaning forward slightly, drawn into the personal opening. What I didn't understand was that I was already successful. I was already doing work that mattered. I was already solving problems that established firms couldn't solve. The only thing missing was my own recognition of that fact, and the courage to demand that others recognize it too. I clicked to my first slide, which showed a timeline of cybersecurity challenges that had been solved by independent consultants over the past 5 years. The most innovative solutions in our industry aren't coming from the biggest firms or the most established consultants. They're coming from people who think differently, who approach problems without preconceptions, who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom because they haven't been taught that certain things are impossible. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering case studies of successful independent consulting projects, analysis of industry trends toward specialized expertise, and recommendations for how established firms could better support and collaborate with independent contractors. But underneath the technical content was a deeper message about the value of different perspectives and the importance of creating space for unconventional approaches to succeed. During the question and answer session, a woman from a mid-sized consulting firm raised her hand. "Miss Parker, you've talked about the advantages of independent consulting, but what about the challenges? How do you handle the isolation, the uncertainty, the constant need to prove yourself?" The question struck at something I'd been thinking about throughout my journey. "You're right that those challenges are real," I said. "But I've learned that isolation isn't the same as independence, and uncertainty isn't the same as instability. When you're building something authentic, something that reflects your actual skills and values, you discover that you're not as alone as you thought. People who recognize quality work will find you, and they'll support you in ways you never expected." I glanced toward my family in the front row, catching Victoria's eye. Sometimes the people closest to us are the last to understand what we're building, not because they don't care about us, but because they're measuring our success against metrics that don't capture what we're actually accomplishing. That's not their failure or ours. It's just the nature of doing something new. After the presentation, the networking reception buzzed with conversations about cybersecurity trends, business development strategies, and the future of consulting. I found myself at the center of multiple discussions, fielding questions about Blackwood Industries' approach, sharing insights about client relationship management, and offering advice to other independent consultants who were facing challenges I remembered well. But the conversation that mattered most happened when my family approached me near the end of the reception. Victoria reached me first, her eyes bright with emotion. "Lily," she said, "that was incredible. Not just the technical content, but the way you talked about building something authentic, about demanding recognition for work that matters. I kept thinking about all the times I dismissed what you were doing because it didn't look like success to me." "You weren't wrong to want success for me," I replied. "You were just working with a definition that didn't fit what I was building." My mother stepped forward, carrying herself with the kind of dignity that had always made her presence felt in any room. "Lily, your father and I owe you an apology, not just for not understanding your work, but for not trusting your judgment about your own career. You knew what you were doing long before we could see it." "Mom," I said, "you don't need to apologize for wanting stability and recognition for me. You were protecting me the best way you knew how." Maybe, my father interjected, but we should have been asking you what you needed instead of telling you what you should want. The acknowledgement settled between us like a bridge being built across years of misunderstanding. It wasn't a magical transformation that erased all the hurt, but it was genuine recognition of where we'd all made mistakes and how we could do better going forward. Ryan shook my hand with the kind of respect I'd seen him show to business partners and colleagues. Lily, I wanted you to know that my company implemented the security protocols you recommended 6 months ago. We haven't had a single breach since then, and our IT costs have actually decreased because the system is so much more efficient. I'm glad it's working well for you, I said. More than working well. It's been transformative. We're expanding into new markets because we have confidence in our data security, and we're attracting clients who see robust cybersecurity as a competitive advantage. Uncle Ben approached with his characteristic gentle smile, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the aftershave he'd worn for as long as I could remember. Kiddo, he said, I always knew you were building something special. I just didn't know it was going to be this special. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, Marcus approached our group with Tom Rodriguez and several other Blackwood Industries executives I'd come to know well over the past months. Lily, Marcus said, I wanted your family to hear this directly from me. The cybersecurity division has exceeded every projection we made when we launched it. We're ahead of revenue targets, client satisfaction scores are the highest in this company, and we're getting inquiries from firms across the country who want to replicate our model. He turned to address my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, you should know that your daughter has built something remarkable. Not just a successful consulting practice, but a new approach to cybersecurity that's influencing how the entire industry thinks about client relationships and problem solving. We're beginning to understand that, my mother replied with a warmth that encompassed both pride and regret. More than that, Marcus continued, we're promoting Lily to vice president of the cybersecurity division. She'll be responsible for strategic planning, team development, and representing our approach to industry organizations and potential partners. The announcement caught me completely off guard. Vice president. At 31 years old, with no traditional corporate background, I was being offered an executive position at one of Portland's most respected technology companies. The promotion wasn't just about recognition, it was about trust, about being seen as someone capable of shaping the direction of an entire division. Marcus, I said, I'm honored. And yes, absolutely, yes. The celebration that followed spilled out into the Portland evening, with my family joining several Blackwood Industries colleagues for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. The conversation flowed easily between technical discussions about cybersecurity trends and personal stories about career development and family dynamics. Victoria found herself in an animated discussion with Sarah Chen about marketing strategies for technology companies, while my father peppered Tom Rodriguez with questions about the business development process. My mother listened intently as David Kumar explained the technical challenges of securing medical data systems, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. But it was during a quiet moment toward the end of the evening, when most of the table was engaged in separate conversations, that Victoria leaned over to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Lily, she said quietly, can I tell you something? Of course. Ryan and I have been talking about having children, and when we do, I want them to know their Aunt Lily as the woman who built something amazing, not as the sister who took a long time to figure things out. The words hit me with unexpected, emotional force. Victoria wasn't just apologizing for past dismissals, she was actively working to change how she saw me, how she talked about me, how she would represent me to future generations of our family. That means everything to me, I said, and meant it. I've been thinking about that speech I gave at my engagement party, Victoria continued, about your different perspective on success and responsibility. I was so focused on the word different that I missed the word perspective. You weren't failing to understand success. You were seeing it from a different angle, building towards something I couldn't recognize because I'd never seen it before. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus calling for a toast. "To Lily Parker," he said, raising his wine glass, "who taught all of us that the most valuable consultants aren't the ones with the most impressive credentials, but the ones with the most innovative solutions." The toast was echoed around the table, but I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of struggling to pay rent while building something I believed in. The family dinners where I'd minimized my accomplishments to avoid uncomfortable questions. The engagement party where I'd felt like a ghost at my own family's celebration. All of that struggle had been leading to this. Not just professional success, but authentic recognition for work that reflected my actual skills and values. Not just family acceptance, but genuine understanding of what I'd been trying to accomplish. Not just individual achievement, but the platform to help other people build something meaningful. As we left the restaurant and walked through downtown Portland, the city lights reflecting off rain-slicked streets, I found myself walking beside Ryan while Victoria chatted with my parents a few steps ahead. "Lily," Ryan said, "I have to ask you something. That night at the engagement party when my father approached you, did you have any idea what was coming?" "None whatsoever," I replied. "I thought he was going to make polite conversation about the weather or ask me what I did for work." "He'd been talking about finding that consultant for months," Ryan said. "He was frustrated because the work was so impressive, but he couldn't track down who had actually done it. When he made the connection that night, when he realized the consultant he'd been hunting for was sitting in the corner wearing a guest badge." Ryan shook his head with the kind of wonder that comes from witnessing an unlikely coincidence. He told me later that it was like finding a unicorn. This brilliant consultant he'd been searching for turned out to be family. "Not family yet," I said with a smile, "but close enough." The evening ended with my parents dropping me off at my apartment, the same small space in the Alberta Arts District where I'd spent 3 years building a business and wondering if it would ever lead anywhere meaningful. But now, instead of feeling like a temporary stopping point, it felt like the foundation for everything that had followed. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the email I'd received that afternoon from a journalist at Wired magazine who wanted to interview me for a feature story about the future of cybersecurity consulting. 6 months ago, the idea of being profiled in a national technology publication would have seemed impossible. Now it felt like a natural extension of the work I was already doing. I also thought about the call I'd received from a conference organizer in San Francisco who wanted me to deliver the opening keynote at a cybersecurity summit next spring. The theme was Innovation Beyond Credentials, and they specifically wanted someone who could speak to the value of non-traditional approaches to technical problem solving. But perhaps most significantly, I thought about the message I'd received from a young woman in Seattle who had read the TechCrunch article about my confrontation with TechBridge Consulting. She was a recent college dropout who had been building freelance web development skills while working retail jobs to pay rent. She wanted advice about how to transition into cybersecurity consulting and whether it was possible to build a successful practice without traditional credentials. I'd spent an hour on the phone with her, sharing resources, recommending learning paths, and most importantly, encouraging her to trust her instincts about what kind of work felt meaningful to her. It was the kind of conversation I wished I'd had access to during my early freelance years, and it reminded me that success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about creating space for other people to build something authentic too. As I settled into sleep that night, I realized that the story that had begun with Victoria calling me a loser at her engagement party had evolved into something much larger than personal vindication. It had become a story about the value of different perspectives, the importance of authentic work, and the power of demanding recognition for accomplishments that don't fit traditional definitions of success. The different perspective on success and responsibility that Victoria had once dismissed had turned out to be exactly what the industry needed. The unconventional path that had worried my parents had led to opportunities they never could have imagined. The work that had seemed risky and uncertain had provided more stability and recognition than any traditional career path could have offered. But more than that, I'd learned that belonging isn't about fitting into spaces that already exist. Sometimes it's about building new spaces where your skills and values can flourish, and then inviting other people to join you there. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust your own judgment about what you're capable of accomplishing, even when the people closest to you can't see it yet. 6 months from now, I'd be standing on a different stage, addressing a different audience, sharing insights about cybersecurity innovation and independent consulting. But I'd also be representing something larger, the possibility that success can look different than we expect, that expertise can develop outside traditional institutions, and that the most valuable perspectives often come from people who approach problems without preconceptions about what's supposed to be possible. The young woman in Seattle who had called for advice would be watching that presentation, along with dozens of other independent consultants who were building something authentic, despite uncertainty about where it might lead. And maybe, if I did my job well, some of them would find the courage to trust their own expertise, demand recognition for their accomplishments, and build the kind of career that reflects who they actually are rather than who they think they're supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.